work for us. We have Alba Cid, who I will introduce in more detail. I'll introduce their full bios in a moment, but we have Alba Cid, Brian Kirk, and Susan Musgrave. I'm very excited to introduce them to you, and we will hear their poetry, and towards the end we will then have a Q&A to maybe discuss their work in more detail and get to know about their process and, you know, in producing their work. So we're going to get straight into our first guest, who is Alba Cid, who is a Galician poet and researcher. She lives between Santiago de Compostela and Oxford, where she directs the John Rutherford Centre for Galician Studies at the University of Oxford. She is a contributing editor to Dorna and reviews poetry frequently as a guest on a Galician radio programme. Her debut poetry collection is called Atlas, published by Galaxia in 2019, for which she won the Miguel Hernández National Young Poetry Prize 2020. She is also one of 4 winners of the 2019 Words Without Borders Poems in Translation, and translations of her poems by Jacob Rogers have appeared in Poem a Day, Asymptote, Action Books, The Offing, and are also forthcoming from the Kenyon Review Online. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our first guest, Alba Cid.
So, hi, good evening. I wanted to start by saying how exciting it is for me to be part of this festival, and thank you so much for the invitation. I'm going to read a few poems from Atlas, from this book, and my first poetry book in Galician. When I began writing these natural history poems, let's say, I was, and I am indeed, captivated by plants, by etymologies, by near and distant cultural practices and languages also. So Atlas is divided into different cycles for all 5 continents. And we are going to follow that path through some of these places, starting with the European cycle and moving along. And I want to thank always Meg Berkobien and Jacob Rogers as the wonderful translators of the versions that you are going to see here. So let's begin exactly with the European cycle. Historia apócrifa dos tulipáns ou as alucinacións nos Países Baixos. 1. As plantas perennes precisan de moito tempo para crecer. É o caso dos tulipáns, as frechas envelenadas do teixo, as historias. 2. Contra a crenza popular, floristas incluídas, os tulipáns non son orixinarios de Holanda, senón de Anatolia. Esa é a aclaración que introducirei canda as mans na terra, artillería de sedas, prudencia inútil dunha alianza que cambias de dedo e perdes igualmente. Tal vez che musite, incluso, que Anatolia procede do grego, que desde os peristilos xónicos significaba leste, e conforme se erguían as 1500 estancias do palacio de Cnosos, a palabra soldábase con Ana Telein, que ven sendo alba, que ven sendo erguerse sobre calquer horizonte. Pequena occidental, confías na historia das palabras porque nunca puideches confiar na dos homes. 3. En Ankara ou Kayseri, cando un pequeno non pode dormir, un adulto pel de cedro pousalle unha man no peito e conta a historia do barco que se fai ao mar. A man é poderosa, controla a respiración do insomne, o tempo que reproduce a viaxe marítima. Deste modo, o mar Exeo inicia baixo as costelas e o navío que fará chegar os primeiros tulipáns ao norte de Europa deixa unha sombra moito máis densa que a das algas. 4. Ten cuidado de plantalos coas raíces cara abaixo, dis. Foi así. Os holandeses comeron os bulbos chegados de Turquía convencidos de que eran cebolas. Cortáronos, guisáronos imagina familias enteiras mastigando diminutos códices de cores futuras arredor de grandes mesas de ameneiro. Despois das comidas, tiñan pesadelos. Na bolsa, tamén di que pode agregarse fariña de oso ou calquera outro fertilizante para o ben da planta. Pero aquí non temos diso. Como xustificaríamos aquí o luxo da carne ausente, o luxo da terra negra para unha simple floración? 5. A finais de abril, sen cultivador oficial de palacio, quen dirá se sabia, ó miñador, a unha perla otomá? Quen dirá non te abras, aínda non, as terras do oeste non che serán propicias? And we have one more for the European cycle, and that is instruccións para rolar o canón do sil. 1. Unha persoa colle a criatura polos brazos e outra polos pés e balancéase cara aos lados mentre recita. Antes de discorrer o río, creváronse as placas. A miles de kilómetros, doutras quebras naceron as montañas amarelas de Lipó e os bosques pétreos de Siberia. Logo apareceu a auga, buscando, como as raíces, as fracturas. 2. Recítase facendo énfase nos movementos descritos, subindo e baixando cos dedos pola barriga do pequeno. A néboa dos vales fluviais é diferente, crin que o sabías. A néboa nos vales fluviais suspende os outonos e a resposta das campás, peta afeito á porta das casas e baixo o seu influxo os homes teixo descenden ás marxes do río e construen escaleiras de Xacob para cultivar as vides. Se a flor da tarde cae aberta, as fillas dos homes entran no río, fan o morto nas beiras, xogan a contar socalcos coa mirada ata que se confunden, rin forte. Mira como brilla a lúa onde os pés delas, tinguíndose, mencía, mentres crecen. 3. Tócanse os dedos do bebé e vanse escondendo conforme enumeramos cousas, así ata escondelos todos. O río non arrastra nada que non sexa ouro, auga bautismal e amigos. O río arrastra os reflexos de toda unha lexión romana consagrada á trepanación dun monte. O río arrastra os extremos dos cigarros do meu avó consagrado á trepanación dun monte. Tardei anos en decatarme do paralelismo. O pai de papá construía túneles mentres lle nacía outro fillo. Non era abril, enxendrando lilas da terra morta. 4. Ao rematar o recitado, tras repetilo varias veces, faise como quen lanza o neno ao aire. Igual que se desvía o río, o leito do río, para buscar ouro no leito primixenio, desvíanse os dedos que descobren a ferida para curala. E a rolín, a rolán, a rolín, a rolán. Okay. So now let's move to the Oceanian cycle. And there you can take a look, I guess, at the photographs, at the visual part of the poem on the translation. So, cartas de navegación polinesias. En algures alguén viaxa furiosamente cara a ti a unha velocidade impensável, non o sentes? Cruzando treboadas de neve, a calor de mil limias, saltos de auga, canóns, pero saberá onde atoparte, poderá recoñecerte cando te vexa e darche o que trae para ti. 1. O tempo dispón os corpos. Cando aprenderemos que todas as cousas se desprazan? As dunas e as algas, a adoración entre iguais, os continentes en cada xornada de traballo das estrelas. Fora do noso campo visual, en completo silencio, fúndanse illas coralíferas. 2. O navegante É capaz de calibrar as correntes do océano dentro do corpo. Apenas un tremor na raíz da espiña dorsal, o aceno dun misto cando prende. O navegante pode dobrarse na proa da súa canoa e apreciar, corpo a corpo, as vibracións do navío, coa mesma sutileza, tap, tap, dos dedos sobre un ábaco. 3. É esta arte un modo de transmitir un saber ou de ocultalo? En terra firme, as mans dos mariños polinesios confeccionan cartas de navegación, tramas, escollen fitas de coco e nervaduras de plantas a modo de correntes mariñas, moedas e cunchas a modo de illas, fíos, coral, os arrecifes non figuran. Da súa habilidade resulta algo que só pode lerse co tacto e que só interpretará correctamente quen o creou. 4. Así, a nosa comprensión dos afectos, a ilexibilidade, a dependencia do tacto, o tecido, unha ruta da seda que coñece a verdadeira violencia do que se dá por sentado. Non adoitaban embarcar as cartas de navegación. Iso quere dicir, isto é meu, é todo canto sei, non deixarei que o modeza o rompa. Coa primeira e a última luz de sándalo insular, cada quen memoriza o seu mapa coas semas dos dedos. 5. Guapepe, rebelib ou medo. 3 xeitos de mapear o océano. A carta que me ensinaches pertencía ao terceiro tipo e imitaba a perfección o perfil dereito de Nefertiti, desde o atol Aur, que coincide co extremo superior da súa coroa lapislázuli, até a meridional Namorik, na baixada do ombreiro. Incluso o Uraeus, a cobra sobre o diadema, parece representada. 6. Como aos mariños das Marshall Islands, os namorados déitanse boca abaixo e espreitan as correntes subxacentes ao seu propio corpo barca. O percutir das sementes dentro da terra, sinfonías leves, trucos de maxia. Pretenden anticiparse á refracción das ondas, calcular o embate, e para iso elaboran medos íntimos, marañas de apuntamentos e cabelos referidos a unha viaxe específica, o modo no que as ondas abrazan certa illa e interseccionan con correntes veciñas, o latexo que cifra a que distancia esa illa pode ser detectada. Fora do seu campo visual, en completo silencio, anéis, innúmeros atois emerxen. Okay, and finally, we move to Asia, and Wing Chun is a martial art. So let's go with Wing Chun do amor como arte marcial. É todo aquilo que medra tan rápido como a erva sobre a tumba dun paxaro, Selan. Os gramos de luz que impactan a terra por segundo, Wright. 2 persoas a mirarse desde beiras opostas da claridade, Carson. Falar diso, do que nos permitimos o luxo de non entender literalmente. Se a luz pode empurrar unha nave espacial, aínda ten preguntas quen sairá gañando. 2 amigas conversan na mesa dun bar a primeira hora. Unha delas repasa a liña das pestañas coa xema do dedo índice, parece realmente afectada. As súas palabras conforman unha mastaba na mente da outra, un recinto dourado. Con razón, mastaba provén do árabe faladoiro que atesoura a súa vez restos do grego antigo estivás, leito de erva. Dáballe leite de egua e curáballe as chagas con pó de violetas, pensa a que escoita. Como acontece nas lendas andinas, como se a efectividade dos remedios se medise pola extrañeza que provocan. Agochada nun bosque, mentres medita, Encmui espreita unha serpe pelexar cun grou. Direccionalidade fronte equilibrio, un esplendor de órbitas e esbeltezas, dous versos de metro desigual encabalgando na boca de quen recita. Encmui observa e memoriza os movementos, a arte. Non hai ordenación que valla no mundo. Se atendemos ao seu relato, a amiga que fala tamén persevera no contacto. Fai súa a técnica do opoñente. Non arremete contra puntos vitais, pero sí contra aqueles que desarman o movemento por vir. Detrás das palabras, músculos, incandescencia, Wing Chun, eterno canto de primavera. A que escoita non sabe se a amiga aprendeu máis do grou ou da serpe. A que escoita pregúntase que amuleto exipcio viría ao caso, se os peixes de cerámica turquesa protexían a portadora de morrer afogada no 1335 a.C., que serviría aquí? De xeito subcutáneo, a mañá avanza como o veleno expulsado grazas ao peche das mandíbulas, unha trabada de serpe. Pouco importa. Permanecen, sen tocarse, unidas no asombro, como as marcas paralelas dos cabeiros na carne da vítima. Okay, and this final poem explores the practice of cormorant fishing. So, ukai da pesca con corvos mariños. O lago Erhai, literalmente mar da orella, pola feitura, queda fora do noso alcance. Tamén o río Nagara, na prefectura de Gifu. Pero con estes depósitos de auga doce compartimos os corvos mariños. Alí, ukai, un método de pesca. Movemento primeiro. Unha barca de bambú esvara mansa sobre a auga estancada. Faino moi lentamente, porque asistimos ao espectáculo por medio de fotografías alleas, imaxes de profesionais e curiosos, imaxes de turistas que bourean detrás das balsas bebendo sake. Se accedésemos aos gravados do período Edo, veríamos lanternas penduradas sobre as barcas. Os artistas recréanse no lume, de modo que os fachos parecen, finalmente, cabeleiras vikingas suspendidas sobre a auga. Acéndense para atraer os peixes, para que baile por última vez o alimento imperial. Movemento segundo. Por veces, na partida, o pescador coloca sobre os sombreiros unha cana de bambú. É San Miguel coa balanza. En cada extremo da vara, un corvo mariño disposto ao traballo. Se acaso abanean, o movemento é imperceptíbel. Burlan todo o que criamos saber sobre o equilibrio. Eríxense en representación da xustiza. Movemento terceiro. Para que as aves non traguen as pezas grandes, estreitanlles o pescozo cun lazo de cánabo. Movemento cuarto. O pescador rodea o peteiro da ave con ambas as mans e extrae o alimento, unha carpa, un peixe gato dourado, do inicio da súa gorxa. É necesaria firmeza e certa forza nas mans para o xesto. Ao cabo, subtraer sempre implica violencia. E supoño que se o frío de prata do Eclesiastés que une a alma ao corpo non lle estivese vedado aos animais miúdos, rompería, plin, antes de caer na cesta do pescado. A ave déixase facer, e a escena recórdanos un verso de Alfred Tennyson. Todo nos quitan. Movemento quinto. O verán imparte unha lección sobre a morte. Non erramos ao sobrepoñer a imaxe do pescador escuálido e a de San Miguel. Ambos administran os tempos, a virtude, teñen sitio no xuízo final e domean o lume. Poderían mesmo adiviñar a fortuna Dicir, aquí está a súa carta, señora, aquí as súas troitas, perlas son o que antes foron os seus ollos, mire. Detido nas ribeiras, calquera pode distinguir o momento do regreso pola pose monumental das aves sobre as balsas. Os corvos mariños estarrícanse para secar e a súa envergadura de ás contribúe á edificación da noite. Na penumbra, a mante selada dun pantocrátor alcanza o pescozo da ave xa liberado do anel e a cariño. Movemento último. Na escena non queda crueza, só auga. Auga e cestos cheos, unha superposición de escamas, as formas extrañas do amor e a vasalaxe. San Miguel, axustando a venda nos ollos da xustiza. Unha ave que come ata saciarse. Okay, and we are going to finish with 2 verses, and those are A luz é coral e ven doutro mundo, ondeamos. Thank you.
That was beautiful. Thank you very much. Nice 2 little lines to end with. Really, really nice language in them, and great work. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
So that was, thank you. So that was Alba Cid, everyone, and we will be talking to you again in the Q&A section at the end. So thanks very much for coming online and for being part of the Winter Warmer. It was great to have you. So we will now move on to our second guest of the evening, which is a poet named Brian Kirk, who is a poet and writer from Dublin. His first collection of poetry, After the Fall, was published by Salmon Poetry in 2017. His poem Birthday won the Listowel Writers' Week Irish Poem of the Year at the An Post Irish Book Awards 2018. And I believe that those book awards happened, was it last night? So the 2021s, of course. And so back to his short fiction chapbook, It's Not Me, It's You, won the Southward Fiction Chapbook competition and was published in 2019. Recent poems have appeared in Poetry Ireland Review, Abridged, Boyne Berries, Skylight 47 and 14 magazine. And he was recently granted a bursary from the Arts Council of Ireland's COVID-19 response to write and film a series of poems called Freedom in Constraint, which focus on the themes of isolation, social distancing, and the wider challenges of COVID-19, which I'm sure we're all very familiar with, and it's great to see work being produced on it. And finally, he's a member of the Hibernian Poetry Workshop, and he blogs at www.briankirkwriter.com. So without further ado, can we please have Brian Kirk?
Thanks very much, Jim, and thanks to everyone at O'Vale, particularly Paul, for inviting me to read. It's a great pleasure to be here and hear so many other great poets over the course of the festival as well. I'd like to start by reading a couple of poems from my first collection that Jim mentioned, After the Fall. It's about 3 years old, this collection now. So I thought I'd read a couple of very short, winter-related poems. And the first one is really, I suppose, it's really just about the colour red and the implications of that colour. So I'll read that one first. Red. The colour of war and of warmth, of Christmas and the blood of martyrs, the poppy of remembrance and the wine that lead like augurs oblivion. When I was a child, reds hid under beds, but I slept soundly, knowing there were russet apples in the bowl at Halloween, when leaves decayed to rust and books were read in secret under covers in the night. Red means stop and to go completely mad. Red mist, a red rag to a bull. It is sin or sex or life or beauty. the shepherd's delight, or perhaps a warning, depending on the sky being red at night or in the morning. The second short poem from the collection I'll read is, again, it's another winter, very short poem called Rotten Apples. Rotten apples. Born too late at end of day, the dead apples fall, blown by the wind, laid out on corrugated tin, covered against gunmetal rain, gathering a fine dust of winter flies, turning, I can smell them still. Jim mentioned there that I've been working this year on a sequence of poems called Freedom in Constraint, and I came up with the idea, I suppose, to write a series of or a sequence of formal poems that, and the formality within them would reflect the constraints that we're all living under at the moment with COVID and the pandemic. So I wrote a couple of these. I've written 9 of these and filmed 9. My daughter filmed 3 of them for me, and another friend of mine, Peter McCluskey, has filmed a further 6. So there's 9 poems that you can view at your leisure on YouTube or whatever, or at my website when you have a moment. But I just thought I'd read 2 of them just to give you a flavour of the kind of work that is coming out with. The first one is called Letting Go, and it's a recent one. So it's written, a lot of them are around the time of the year, but they're very domestic because of the nature of people being locked away, I suppose, and not being able to mix in social gatherings the way they once would have. So the first one is Letting Go. In May, you threw good money after bad. Food, shoes, a magic pen that wipes out stains. Too long at home, uncertain, somewhat sad, watch days drift by through dusty window panes. Distracted for a while by phone, iPad, held like a battery, concentration drains. A new way has arrived, and you endure with little choice, distracted and unsure. The summer passed, and nothing seemed to change. You formed a bond with absence. Now distance became the calculus of safety's range, stumbling on the path of least resistance when you moved at all, denying how strange the world had grown, proceeding in a trance, no longer able to remember when you dreamed you had your own life back again. September came, October following. You opened up your eyes as from a sleep and saw the dancing trees were following. Oak, blackthorn, ash, elm, juniper and beech, red, gold and bronze, the green leaf yellowing to white. You understood such beauty cannot keep. The trees, despite their agitation, also know these colours are a sign they must let go. And the second one out of the sequence that I'll read is called Dog Days, which I suppose it's an overview of kind of where we've come from, and I suppose that we really haven't come very far, I suppose, is what the poem is saying, perhaps, in the limited movement of it. It's a sestina, which can be tricky and involves a lot of repetition of words, but it does reflect the kind of the nature of the monotony, I suppose, of the days for many people. Dog Days. Summer came scampering into the house this year, uncalled for, dragging garden smells and muddy paws, and a new silence coloured by a yellow, ever-present sun that threatened but never delivered storms. On humid nights, you were visited in dreams by memories of failure, the unfulfilled dreams of your youth. You cowered while the house held its breath in expectation of a storm that never came. Something stirred in the garden. Orion's dog slept under a shade in the sun, tongue lolling, his breath breaking the silence, laboured, hoarse, excavating the silence of your mind, making room for more dreams, vague anxieties fostered under a glaring sun. You grew accustomed to being a prisoner in your house. The known world extended to the bottom of the garden, no further, but the TV brought you closer to the storm and drang of peoples tearing each other apart, storms in teacups to you who measured out each day in silence. Heat spilled out the open windows into the garden, searing the grass, choking flowers, while you dozed, dreaming of disease, death, and decay consuming the house. Outside, it was worse, speared under a burning sun, unable to pretend that everything was normal, to sun yourself and watch the skies, wait for the storm to pass. Your impatience could not be housed by an absence that knew no other form but silence. Worse than sleeping was the waking dream, finding yourself alone and standing in the garden, looking around, naming what you see. Garden, grass, trees, bent flowers, dying under the hot sun, knowing you haven't been away, just in a dream, wishing to hell that something would change, the storm might break, the children next door might assault the silence. After a while you give up, go back inside the house. After this summer of silences, you are primed to storm the garden's barricades and reach up to pull the sun down out of the sky into your fevered dreams, your hollow house. And that's just a flavour, I suppose, of the formal poems that are in the sequence. And I suppose during that time, during the years and the early part of it as well, a lot of people found themselves, being confined to the house to a great deal. I found myself trying to clear out a room downstairs and going through lots of old papers and books and clearing out, trying to move things around. And I came across, in doing that, I came across old writings that I'd done and things that I found belonged to people I knew a long time ago. And I wrote this short poem, and this poem, Palimpsest, is it has now become sort of the main poem in a way of the new collection that I'm working on. It's a very short poem again, it's a prose poem, Palimpsest. Kids almost grown, but the house more crowded than ever. I'm clearing out the room downstairs, full of accumulated junk, half-forgotten remnants of a life, tokens, totems of another person's life. I come across all these pages, some typed, some handwritten, that I can't remember writing, and among them I find the stories that you wrote, typed on the sad underwood with the sticky ribbon, and on the back of one a poem I wrote about you sleeping when we knew or cared nothing about futures in the flat in Canning Town after a night of drinking in the scud. I suppose that idea of time and looking back does appear in my poetry a lot. And I suppose if there is to be a theme, I suppose, for this reading, maybe tonight, maybe time is the thing that binds a lot of the poems together. And at this time, it's not just about looking back, but it's about looking forward as well. I think I'm finding the resourcefulness, I think, to look forward as well. The next poem I'd like to read is a poem called Excursion into Philosophy, which is an ekphrastic poem based on an Edward Hopper painting from 1959, which is, I suppose it's about a breakdown in communication. It features two figures in it who are, although one is lying in the bed and the other is sitting on the edge, they might as well be miles apart. It's a short poem. It was recently published in 14 magazine by Richard Skinner. I'll read it anyway. Excursion into Philosophy. We are only ever alone, sharing the sunlit room, our backs almost touching could be miles apart. The discarded book remains open, read or unread. The moment unfolds, trapped between two rectangles of light. Outside, the sky is sky blue, the ground in shadow. Inside, it's awful. Something is over. Something new has yet to be born. Knowledge comes with the heft of a blow. Light opens out as space closes in. Are beginnings and endings the same? And my next poem that I'd like to read, again, it's another poem, and I suppose it's called Ahimsa, and it's about, I suppose, the principle of non-violence, but it's a kind of a moment, it's a poem of a moment rather than a narrative poem. It's a glimpse, I suppose, and there's a kind of a study of fatherhood, I suppose, in it as well. It was published in Skylight 47 this year. Ahimsa. The real world is unknown, the known unreal, I tell myself. We argue on the seafront amid the day trippers and down and outs. I want to walk away, but follow you instead. At the aquarium, everything flip-flops. The squid withdraw while the ray overact, flapping and splashing as they move in a circle. I follow you down to the shark tank where it's even darker. There are no words, only the whispered awe of children soaked in the shadows of silent fathers. Outside, there will be ice cream, shouts of animal joy and reprimands, but in this sanctum there is peace. On the prom, a bold child bolts across the busy road. The startled father shows his love with smacks and tears. I tell myself, ahimsa is the highest virtue. I find you at the coffee stand, red-eyed, and beg forgiveness. In the first collection, in Out the Fall, I think maybe I don't know whether it's always like this with first collections, but me was certainly, there was a lot of memory poems. There was poems about childhood. I suppose this poem that I'm going to read next is a bit of a hangover from that preoccupation. It's a memory of the 1970s, growing up in a small town, North County Dublin in Rush, which was a seaside town, and every summer a lot of people came from the city and stayed in caravans and mobile homes and enjoyed the sea and whatever else the town had to offer. But there was always an element of a threat of violence, I suppose, as well, with people coming in. There was a fad for skinheads and people like that in the 70s as well. But as a child, it kind of struck me this kind of sense of danger that came, and also a sense of excitement as well about the summer when there were so many people in what was normally a very, very quiet town. This poem is called Hard Swallows. Every summer they came back, hard swallows with pinched city faces, bullet heads, black boots and braces, ink tattoos and traces of abuse we took for attitude. Sitting on the wall across from Leisureland, drinking cider, spitting, shirts off in the midday sun. We crossed the road to pass them, trying not to look, but our eyes were drawn to these exotic summer visitors, thirsty for a sip of urban squalor, bored with the blunt routine of school and farm in this backwater. By evening, their numbers grew. The squad car took a turn around the town. The air felt heavy like a storm might break. The pubs won't serve, but the dark dunes welcome them, along with certain local girls who can't resist their tattooed arms, flat vowels that bend their names into a novel sound, unfamiliar, overwhelmed with wistful possibility, until the word gets out and there's murder on the street. While happy families sleep, it starts with threats, builds to shouts and screams, breaking glass, car engines roaring down the darkened street. Sun rises and the town is not the same. Shopkeepers boarding broken windows, sweeping glass out of the road, boiling kettles to remove the blood that dries like clotted paint on concrete. Every summer was the same. Every summer they came back. The next poem again is it's another preoccupation, I suppose, that was in the first collection as well. It was aging or growing older, and this poem, I think it's called 50 Years Later, and it tries to address the idea of aging with a sense of kind of hope for the future, and with a bit of courage, I think. You know, there's an epigraph at the start from Samuel Beckett's famous play Crop's Last Tape, where he says, "Perhaps my best years are gone when there was a chance of happiness, but I wouldn't want them back, not with the fire in me now." So this is 50 years later. A new wind shakes the green branches as you shuffle along. How the weeks have flown since Easter, blown like April blossoms, like petals from the early rose, dull fires on dewy grass you'll never mow again. What took you back to this place after all these years? Not faith or fear of death or loneliness. Get up off your knees, fill your lungs and sing the song you sang so long ago. Confirm spring's resolution in this summer of your winter. Profess to fathom wrong from right, to practice strength, wisdom and love, to dream, to strive to be all things, the lion, lamb and dove. I've just two more poems I'd like to read at this stage. Again, both of them, I suppose, are time or memory related. The first one is Multiverse, it's called, and it has to do with time moving forwards and backwards, I suppose, past, present, and future, and it tries to make a coherence out of the three somehow. There is again an epigraph to this poem, and in Greek there's two words for time. There's chronos, which is what times would normally know it in chronology, and kairos, which is a different kind of time. It's almost like opportunity. So the epigraph is from Hippocrates, and it's every kairos is a chronos, but not every chronos is a kairos. So this is Multiverse. Once upon a time, in a land not very far away, I was a version of myself before I met a prototype of you. Two opposites collided in imagined space, auguring a future harmony, unexpected but awaited. We sensed an opportunity, a spontaneous knitting of perspectives, gauche, sophisticated, beyond the accidents of birth. We shared a sense of quest, fated in a sacred logos, set forth upon an epic journey that took us back to here, where we are now. The sense of so much living crammed into moments that collapse, unfold in arcane sequences, altered as occasion might demand. Dates like fairy lights strung across a darkening garden when the party's almost over and the next day hovers in the branches. Dim outline of morning, promising fatigue and argument, desire to sleep in bed beside you long after the alarm's been silenced by a hand much like the one that knocks, demands you meet the future, a concept that will be elusive yet concrete, indefinite, but growing sharper every day. It's time to rise and rush into that future, past the present, outrunning time's arrow, outpacing yourself in the narrow stream of things that constitute a life. Keep going. You must be ready always for the moment when the stars align, before the arrow falls, or after memory unspools a remnant on the floor. Light dies, and when a different light emerges, more blinding than before, you believe in magic once again. A child cries, an old man dries his eyes. The final poem I'd like to read is, it's for my parents. It's called Googling My Parents. And I suppose it's, my parents died a long time before the internet existed. And it's hard to know like how they would be in the world that we have now, or how they would fit in. But they still obviously exist in my own mind and in the minds of my family and the people who knew them, and they affected. But this is an attempt, I suppose, to hang on to them in a way. It's called Googling My Parents. Before I read it, I just want to say thanks once again to everyone at O'Vale, to Paul and to Jim, and I'm really looking forward to hearing Susan's reading. I really enjoyed Alba's beforehand. But thanks once again. Googling My Parents. When I Googled my parents, there were no matching results, only traces of others who bore the same names, living counterfeit lives that failed to reflect the authenticity of monochrome days I recall in that house by the railway line, where the sun shone all summer, where huge ash trees waved their hysterical arms in March winds, and a thin frost painted a dull world silver on the shortest days. My parents don't exist in the world, real or virtual, but are trapped in stacks of wrinkled snaps. They look out at me with unseeing eyes, perplexed, uncertain, frozen in a moment snatched from time. I know there's no option to reboot, no going back except through memories patched up matinee. From time, to kickstart reminiscence, I read their names in stone among a host of other names on stones, ranged on a blanket of land that rolls down to the sea near home. Perhaps the mind is a hard drive, scanning the residue of lives no longer with us, its circuits switching on and off, firing in dreams where the dead eyes, their voices talking out of the bright cloud. Thank you.
We can't hear you, Jim. Still can't hear you, Jim. Do you want to refresh the link? I'll let you back in, maybe? Let's try that.
Okay, can you hear me now?
I can hear you, yeah. Yes, good.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, can hear.
Any sound? Okay, great. Okay, maybe I shouldn't have worn this top. It's got gremlins on it. I just got it, so I think that they've been interfering with the sound. Not a good day to wear that top. But okay, so thanks very much, Brian, for your poetry, and I've really enjoyed it. We're going to move on to our last poet now, Susan Musgrave. So just to introduce her, so Susan Musgrave has published more than 30 books. She has been nominated and won awards for writing in poetry, fiction, non-fiction, children's book, and work as an editor. A new book of poetry, Exculpatory Lilies, will be published by McClelland and Stewart in 2022. In April 2020, her poem Wild and Alone took third place in the Fish Poetry Competition, judged by Billy Collins. She lives in Haida Gwaii off Canada's northwest coast, where she owns and manages Copper Beach Guest House. So you know where to stay if you're in Canada. And she teaches poetry in UBC's MFA's program in creative writing. She spends a part of every year in the west of Ireland and would like her obituary to read, "She died in Ireland," but not yet. So thanks very much. Can we have Susan Musgrave, please?
Hi, thank you so much. I stole that from George and Macbeth because in his, I read an obituary of George's and it said he died in Ireland, and I was so envious because the whole time I'd known him, he'd resisted Ireland. He was very Scottish, but in the end he moved to Tuam and died there. So thanks, Paul, for inviting me. I'm delighted to be here, and I practiced my Irish all morning, but now that I'm live, I'm not going to attempt it, having been corrected already. And it's so easy to mispronounce these words. I wanted to say to Brian, and thank you both to the poets who came before me. It was wonderful listening again to poetry. It's been a long time. I had a contrarian daughter who at the age of 6 would, every time we came to a red light, would say, red means go, green means stop. And I couldn't convince her that was not the truth. I said, I hope by the time you get your driver's license, you'll have changed your mind. And she did. In 1945, Patrick Kavanagh visited Dunsany in County Meath, and this is a place that my mother and I have been going together for the last 15 years. Apparently, Patrick Kavanagh was pursuing a young lady, and he wrote 2 lines that I have in front of me on the wall, 2 of my favorite lines. There will be bluebells growing under the big trees, and you will be there, and I will be there in May. I don't know what it is about the simplicity of lines like that just do something. Anyway, I was supposed to be in Ireland last May, and of course I wasn't. But instead I stayed home and read every book I could find of Tim Robinson's. I was on the Aran Islands last year, and I have been the year before to Inishmaan, and it was my way of staying in touch with Ireland, was just to read 3 or 4 pages of this exquisite writing. And really, it was impossible not to let his language influence my own ear, because it was like reading poetry. And it's a poem called Water, Comma, and it's inspired by a kind of vodka that's made in San Francisco called Fog Point, and it's made with water harvested from San Francisco fog. I really like the name and the idea much more than the effect. Sloshed on fog, that's how I'd like to go, drunk on immortality, like something from a poem by Emily Dickinson, whose last words were, I must go in, the fog is rising. Wouldn't I love to whisper something so specific when I succumb? Then sip fog with Emily in the afterlife, the 2 of us on a storm beach, cold with rain and sea fret, passing the bottle, kibitzing about inconsistent use of capitalization and our leisurely flowering of consciousness, the awful letting go. Emily wrote, water, comma, is taught by thirst. And I've always wanted to know not why the thirst, but why the comma. I might ask her if I can see my way clear. Fog has a way of spreading its winding sheet, obliterating our life's words, complaint of rock against wave, wave against shore. Words that rain, cruel words and kind, like the last words spoken to Jesus by a thief. Words that weigh like beached whales who smother themselves under the greasy freight of their bodies. How quickly we utter our own final words and fail to recognize them as our own. I seldom enter literary contests simply because I don't like not winning, and if I don't enter, it avoids more disappointment. But I did enter the fish poetry competition in Cork last year because Billy Collins was the judge. My friend Angela Long sent me, I think on the last day, I was able to submit a note saying you must enter this contest. And so imagine my great surprise when I took 3rd place. Angela herself won honorable mention, so otherwise I wouldn't mention my winning because it might hurt her feelings if she's listening. And but I thought how odd that 2 women poets from an obscure island in the North Pacific would win. Must have caused some conversation around the office. The poem is called Wild and Alone, and these books arrived this week in the post office, caused great excitement in the post office because the box had been interfered with, even though the copies were still intact, and it came all the way from Ireland, so it doesn't happen very often here in Masset. So Wild and Alone. Our first winter together, we rented Pilgrim's Cottage near Ballyconneely in the west of Galway. The wind-tormented days spent desperately burning turf. One night I found a mouse in the cutlery drawer, feasting on crumbs, and carried him out to the turf shed where I released him. Our ancient neighbour Val, who had not yet learned to trust light bulbs, had a great strength for the weakness, whiskey tasting of smoke, rain, and the road Atlantic Sea. I tried to pick a fight with Sean when he stumbled in late under our old neighbour's influence. So relieved he was alive, I wanted to kill him. Does it get more romantic than that? He wouldn't fight back, picked up his book and pretended to read. I freed the frayed copy of Under the Volcano from his hands and hurled it on the guttering fire where it refused to burn, growing thickly black. I didn't know then our love was doomed, to last. Watching as the mouse ran back up the path I'd so recently taken, through the open cottage door into the sacred heart of Mrs. Pilgrim's kitchen, where he resumed his meal as if to remind us interlopers, wild and alone is the way to live. So, for my last book, it's called Origami Dove, a poem about being Canadian. I wrote it for the night of the millennium. I was commissioned by the CBC. They along with everyone else, was convinced that the world would end, and they wanted to go out with a bang with Canadian writers reading their works. And I read signs wherever I go. The first time I flew to Ireland, I saw a sign in the airport that said, in big letters, depressed, suicidal, the Good Samaritans can help. And there was a phone number. And I thought, I finally found a place in the world where I belong, where I'm at home. This poem is called Rest Area, No Loitering, and Other Signs of the Times. Pick your rut carefully. You will be in it for the next 80 miles, warned a sign on a stretch of bad road near head-smashed-in Buffalo Jump, Alberta. I love my country because even though we've been called the Vichyssoise of nations, cold, half French, and difficult to stir, we are honestly everything we pretend to be, one nation of 80 ethnic groups who still base our fashion taste on what doesn't itch. If the United States is like the guy at the party who gives everyone cocaine and still can't get anyone to like him, north of the 49th parallel where all our Christmases are white, Canadians are the life of the party. God gave us memories so we could have roses in winter, they say, in Manitoba, but on Vancouver Island we know the cold of a Canadian winter can kill even a memory. Gather ye rosebuds was my old father's best advice. The average Canadian considers life too short to stuff a mushroom, thinks poutine is French cuisine, is too polite to take the last piece of Christmas cake from the plate, the last pierogi from the pot. The average Canadian says, I'm sorry, 4.8 times a minute. We are a self-effacing nation, a well-mannered lot. Americans say no to drugs. Canadians say no thank you. We are not elitists, says our new Governor General. Ask anyone who matters. Canadians are unarmed Americans with health care. A sign on the door of the Ontario legislature reads, warning to all personnel, firings will continue until morale improves. Red Fox said health nuts are going to feel stupid someday, lying in hospital, dying of nothing. But the unarmed in Canada will be covered. If I had my life to live over, I'd live over Haida Bucks in Masset on Haida Gwaii, order skim milk latte made from organic shade-grown beans only. Whenever I felt lonely, I'd drive down to Margaret's Cafe in Queen Charlotte City, where a sign immemorial says, tomorrow has been cancelled due to lack of interest. I'd order spaghetti to go. What person on this planet can feel lonely while eating spaghetti? My new philosophy for the millennium, dread one day at a time. Wake up on New Year's Day and smell what's left of the roses. Pick your rut carefully, but remember, better to be behind a police car than in front of one. When you die, there is going to be a big vacuum in your life, so make hay while the sun still shines through the ozone layer. Raise a glass to the future. Taste the stars. Well, in my excitement about reading, I forgot to read the second poem that I had planned to read, back to the fish anthology. I have so many of them. I think they sent me 10, or maybe 5. Some might have gone missing when the parcel got tampered with. Probably customs deciding whether or not they let this anthology through. It was edited by Clem Cairns of Cork, and the book is prefaced with a quote by Mr. Bob Dylan, some people feel the rain, others just get wet. So I was going to then introduce where I live, which I already have, sort of, but Haida Gwaii is just south of Alaska. You can see Sarah Palin on a clear day. We joke here. And we're about 8 hours off the coast of British Columbia, northwest coast of British Columbia. It's a rainforest, so we not only feel the rain every day, well, we see it, and we get wet, and we all kind of like it. The epigraph in this poem is, "The tears I shed yesterday have become rain," by Thich Nhat Hanh. I almost weep for myself, for this, having to be human. Did you ever hear of loneliness, did you? I let the days enter me. I let loneliness be the choir that requires I sing alto when I wish to be a soprano. I could reach the high notes, I promise you, if only I could learn to breathe. I don't know how to breathe. If I breathed, I could be rain, I could fall. How fiercely have you loved your days, have you? How few days are left, what few hours. For now I know this, the broken bottles our lives are. It's actually true, I don't know how to breathe. I had pneumonia a few years ago and the doctor gave me breathing lessons and I realized I was breathing backwards. You're supposed to puff your chest out or do something peculiar. And I thought, I'm over 60 and I don't know how to breathe. No, so it wasn't just a metaphor. But luckily, I must know something about it since I'm still standing here. A new book, The Exculpatory Lilies. The title comes from a New Yorker cartoon, a woman saying to her husband, "It's been weeks since you brought me exculpatory lilies." And it always stuck with me, that phrase, even though exculpatory isn't a word that I use very much in my everyday going about town. But this is the poem with that title, the title poem. Good Friday, the day they delivered that sad bouquet, was the day our cat ran out on the road and failed to look both ways. I'd stashed the candy eggs under the sink in their pink raffia nests, safe amongst the household poisons where the kids had been warned not to go. On Easter Sunday before first light, I stole outside to hide the loot, the family of bunnies in gold foil, the high-quality chocolate you insisted on buying. Nothing's too good for my girls. The lilies, smacking of humility, devotion, had been for me. Your way of saying, sorry, I can stop. I will lose the needle and spoon today. But I was finished. I was through. Said, sorry had been your default setting since the day we vowed I do. I think now I was cruel. The cat darted out, hit the car, staggered back as far as our front gate. For a second, I thought she might have been stunned, nothing more, though the dribble of blood at the corners of her mouth was a small grief with a life of its own. I buried her at the bottom of the garden where I had tossed your exculpatory lilies, and where I picture them still. Each day above ground is a hard miracle, you wrote. I hung on every miraculous breath you took as I stood outside your door at night, dying to hear you breathe. In the end, it wasn't me you turned to, but God. Wasn't love meant to be more pure than faith, more sacred and enduring? These days, I lean heavy into the wind, and the wind's blowing hard. A short poem that smacks of humility and devotion as well. It's called Humility. If I had to be the underwear of somebody famous, I would choose Leonard Cohen to wear me. I would want to be blue because blue's a color you can feel. And how do you think I would feel being intimately associated with Leonard and his private, oh, this could so easily become a confessional poem which was never meant to be. I would want to be smalt, redder and deeper than azurite blue, more like the dusty purple I tried painting the bedroom one smoldering evening when the sun was going down and my lover had left town and Leonard was on the front lawn wearing nothing but me. And finally, I may have mentioned at the beginning, I can't remember now, it seems so long ago, 20 minutes, the time of COVID. A friend of mine is sending out Christmas cards that says Feliz Covidad, which those of you who speak Spanish will know what that means. I realized when I was putting together my reading it list yesterday how many poems feature Ireland in one way or another. It's not surprising because it's really my kind of place I want to live, even though I don't live there. But so many people in the world feel like that. I almost feel like a cliche, but there you go. So Mum and I, for 15 years, once a year, usually in May or sometimes September, would travel to County Meath. And besides buying a new Claddagh ring every time she came to Ireland and had a bottle of Jameson's, duty-free, she had another reason for wanting to stay in County Meath. She died last summer, and so I have her collection of Claddagh rings. And I don't know how many a person can wear, really, but I have one on my finger. The poem is called My Mother Visits Her Beloved in Ireland. I've never known the word airport to look so lonely. all 7 letters, each one an orphan, as we head out of Dunsany for the road to Dunshaughlin. You turn left, his wife said, then you scatter. My mother has loved this man for 30 years, though he will never know. I can't find the road, and neither of us can stop weeping, me for my mother, and she because she believes she'll never see him again. I take her old hand, and she turns her head away, as if feelings are something a person her age shouldn't show. Have you seen any sign, she asks, as I turn onto the M4 by accident, a soulless motorway I exit after paying a mighty toll. Earlier, while she sat in the parlour talking politics with the man she has loved ever since before my father died, I went outside and collected horse chestnuts from his drive. How else to pass the time? Every fall, my father hid horse chestnuts in our house. He believed they would banish the spiders my mother was deathly afraid of. I thought he was mad, but now I do the same. My mother told me before we flew to Ireland she wants to be buried with the pebble she stole from her love's driveway 25 years ago. It's all she asks. I wish I could find her a lovelier stone, but the crushed gravel under my feet today feels too ordinary in a lifeless sort of way. My tears subside somewhere around Swords when Mum starts to fret she has failed to fill in her tax back forms properly. Each one is different. They go out of their way to make it hard. I wonder at how quickly the mind, like the road, is diverted, and why I never take warnings such as road closed, local traffic only, literally. Your father was the same way, my mother says, when I have to turn around and take the detour I should have taken in the first place, then stop for petrol because, as Mum has reminded me for the 2 weeks we've been on holiday, we're supposed to bring the car back full. I still haven't seen any signs, she says, and then, when I suggest we check the map, I don't want to go home. The world isn't big enough for this much sorrow. Is there anywhere, I wonder, we can call home? I tell her we will turn around, go back the way we came, buy a house in the village. She'll see him every day. I don't care where we go, she says, but I know she won't feel this way forever. In the next town we come to, I see it finally posted, Airport 4, and the wind blows through the vowels of the word I wish had never been born. Planes climb into the wind-tossed clouds, the sound they make filling me with the vast sky's emptiness. And suddenly we've arrived. The signs point to Terminal 1, Cargo, Mortuary, Way Out. Jesus, I think. The words airport and mortuary have more than 5 letters in common. Who needs the mortal reminder at this time? I find the hotel, check in, help Mum upstairs, then cut myself trying to open the screw-top bottle of Chilean wine while she fights with the locked window to let in the fresh airport air. Let's not let a little bit of blood spoil the end of our holiday, she says, and raises her glass. Slanchawa, Slanawalya. I bandage my wound, pour another drop. Good health, safe journey. Soon Mum's humming a rebel tune. Thank you. Slangafol.
Thanks so much for that. It was really, really nice to hear your work, Susan. Made me laugh a good few times there and just really enjoyed it. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks.
So we've got everybody back again, all 4 of us together again for the Q&A section of the evening. I guess like your 3 work, I noticed quite some differences between the 3 of you. Like Alba, seems quite researched and has a lot of history embedded in it, and Brian, you kind of have a lot of inspiration from your personal life, and finally Susan, there's a good dose of wit in your work. I'm just curious, what would you 3, like I'd like to hear an answer from the 3 of you. Like what 2 qualities do you most admire in a poem? So we'll start with you, Alba. If you had to say 2 qualities you admire in a poem.
Okay, so, well, I think that even if I have a hard time putting my finger on what moves me exactly, I think that initially it has to be some kind of intuition or some kind of enchantment. I always like being surprised by the poem, right? Or having the feeling that you are reaching a different mind, a completely different mind. So that's really important for me. And yeah, I also guess that, well, holding the signs, holding what we can read and we cannot read, those things that we cannot read so easily, the images that survive and the ones that disappear, anachronisms, complex temporalities, that always moves me also, yeah.
Thank you. It's a good answer. Meeting another mind. Brian? Thank you. Brian?
Yeah, I totally agree with Alba there. I think surprise is like she said the word surprise, and that's the one thing I like in reading a poem or in writing a poem. Certainly in reading poems, I love to be surprised by a poem that you start reading a poem and it takes you somewhere completely different to what you thought at the outset. And we all have kind of notions about what a poem is about, even when we look at the name of a poem. We know it's a poem by a poet that we might have read other work by, but when we start reading it, I think it's great to be surprised. When I'm writing a poem, it's different. I don't think it works. I don't think poetry works if you know, and this goes back to inspiration, I suppose, which is very hard to define, but it doesn't work if you know where you want to be at the end of a poem. It's never going to work. I think the poem has to reveal itself somehow. Now that's easier said than done, but I think the writing of the poem is getting to the stage where when you know it's finished is when you're surprised as the writer, if you like. Do you know what I mean? That, oh, this is what I was actually talking about when I started this, and this is what I was trying to say. And sometimes you might have poems that you've attempted and then you put them aside for a while and you go back to them and you realize that you meant it. You really were trying to talk about something different completely. And sometimes they don't work, and sometimes you just leave them. But I think surprise is definitely the single biggest and important thing.
Yeah. It's interesting you say that. It's a bit like you're writing a poem and then you get to a line and it kind of says, no, we're not going there, we're going this way. You know, it can twist on you in a way that you didn't expect at the beginning. Yeah, I agree with that. And I'd like to hear what you think as well, Susan. So what two qualities would you like to see?
I agree. Surprise is such an interesting word. I think that's what I love about poetry, that the constant, being at war. My husband would always say I was at war with the world, but I think language to me is just, I mean, if I read a word that annoys me in the wrong context, I get so upset because it's ruined my whole day. So I take words really seriously. I'm sure there are a lot of words I don't use correctly either. But in Colombia, there's a saying, it's a sin to be surprised. But I think that's if you're a narco-terrorist. I don't think that applies to poetry. Pound said that rhyming poetry should have an element of surprise. And I tell my students that if you rhyme love with dove, we're probably going to our eyes will glaze over. We won't want to read anymore. So surprise is really an important element, and being surprised yourself, because if you're not surprised yourself, your reader probably won't be. Nabokov too said his definition of art was beauty and pity mixed. So I would say that I look for that in poetry too, I think. And who knows how to define beauty. I could probably more easily define pity, but there's a quality of something you just want to, something that I can't even think of what the word is, but it's an intuitive feeling. You just know when you've read something. Well, Houseman said it was what, the whiskers on your chin stand up. Well, some of us don't yet have whiskers on our chin, but the hair on the back of your neck, if your skin horripilates. I heard that word in New York at a reading. My poetry is horripilating, and I thought that was something awful, but I looked it up. It's okay. But if that happens,
is it like Goosebumps? Then you know you've read it. Yes, if that happens, you're reading a real poem, like a poem that's done it. That's Seamus poem, the postscript, the one with that blows your heart wide open at the end. Even just saying that, I am horripilating. It's a nicer word than goosebumps. I never liked that word. It's not very appealing, the visual of it.
No.
Yeah.
Well, horripilate. Once it sort of try throwing it about when you're down at the pub next time.
All right, thank you. I always like this question. How did you get started as a poet? So we'll start with you, Alba.
And that was exactly when I was a child. I was a great reader. I really read a lot. And I was also, well, I liked a lot drawing. So for me, those were quite related, I should say. So yeah, I think that that physical condition, let's say, right, of the poems also, and that possibility of making a poem as you make an object or as you make a garden, that's something that it became more and more important for me through the years, I guess. So yeah, I began when I was a child. I began reading a lot, and after that, trying to write. Yeah.
So drawing and writing, creating, it's kind of all the same breed of, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you. Brian?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose I was another one of those kids who actually enjoyed poetry at school, one of those strange people who, you know, liked the syllabus and enjoyed reading Kavanagh and Yeats and Austin Clarke or whatever we would have done in those days. And loved, the metaphysical poets and John Donne and George Herbert and things like that, you know, which was kind of like, when I left school, I started writing poetry almost straight away. I didn't really write when I was a teenager, but when I left school, I started writing poetry straight away. And then after a year or two, I felt like I didn't have the right to write it, which is a strange thing to say. So I kind of went to college at night when I started working, just as a reason not to write, to get, you know, to have an excuse to say that I'm not writing because I'm studying now at the minute, because I wasn't sure whether I'd be able to do it, you know. So I did it for a couple of years, then I stopped. I probably stopped for too long, Jim, you know, and then I went back to it when I was in my 30s, really, is when I started writing seriously. So, but I've always read loads, but my poetry, I suppose, was the first thing. I write short stories as well, but poetry was always kind of the first thing that attracted me to literature.
Oh, I'm a bit heartbroken for you as a young man, that you took a job of at night to not write.
Yeah, I know. I was having too good a time, probably, Jim, going out, you know.
Okay, not too heartbroken then. You're maybe building up the inspiration for your 30s. Thank you, Brian. And Susan, how about you? How did you get started?
Well, I listened to a lot of Bob Dylan when I was about 12 or 13, and then I did a lot of LSD when I was 14 or 15 or 16, and ended up, my parents had me committed to an asylum because they thought I was crazy. And a poet called Robin Skelton came to visit me because my psychiatrist had given him some of my poems, and Robin read them and said, "You're not mad, you're a poet." At which, at the time, I didn't think I was mad anyway, but nor did I think I was a poet. He gave me Ariel by Sylvia Plath, and I had Allen Ginsberg's Howl, so I proceeded to write poems that my first poems were said I was the chance daughter of Sylvia Plath and Allen Ginsberg. I borrowed from them quite liberally, put it that way. And that I just never stopped after that. It was the blood jet. I was lucky that I got published. I started sending things out to magazines, and they got accepted. I think I had that niche, the mad West Coast young woman. There are niches these days, but there's not one for that because I already filled that up 40, 50 years ago. So there are different niches now. So I think that if you come along at the right time in terms of, but I moved to Ireland as soon as my first book came out. So I didn't sort of feel that I wasn't reading reviews, or, you know, I really didn't care about the literary world, which I'm glad of. I didn't think, oh, I've got a book out. Isn't that great? I just wanted to write and sit on lonely moors and scribble away, which now I think, why did I waste my youth? I could have had all sorts of romantic liaisons with interesting and famous people, but I didn't. I thought I should sit out on the bog. Yeah, I know.
So you ran for the literary scene. Maybe you got a bit of time to make some more new work then, you know? Like,
I don't know what it was. I didn't really know there was a literary scene. I mean, I didn't know. That's how young I was. I didn't know that, I knew Sylvia Plath had a book. I didn't know she died. I didn't know the story of Ted Hughes. I just knew the words. The language was so incredible. I'd read Tennyson at home. My parents had the collected works of Tennyson. So I must say that some of the rhythms, I still think that the rhythms in my poems they're not as, I can hear sometimes the cadence of this. I wonder where it comes from, but I think it's just a lot of the things things you read when you're young stay with you. I'm glad it was Tennyson, not somebody else. Yeah.
I think I heard someone say that, like, the music or the poetry that you hear at 17 is kind of a real defining influence on you as a creator. Would you also agree, Brian or Alba? Is there like some important music from your team? Yeah.
Not so sure, because I was like really, really open to all kinds of music. At that moment, I was interested in languages, and maybe I was beginning to feel a deep interest in history. So for me, and as I was telling you at the beginning, when I began writing this kind of poems that are more or less like natural history or apocryphal history poems, a few years ago, that was a way to embrace historical discoveries or some curiosities, let's say, and to produce sets of transparencies regarding maybe present debates or present concerns of mine. So I'm not sure that it is just music. Maybe that's, a mix of everything you are discovering at that time, I guess. Yeah.
So you kind of look back at what happened before and how they managed things and see if you can learn from them and incorporate it. I get that. Yeah. So history more so than music. I kind of got that from your work. It had a lot of references from history, and I did hear that in your work tonight. Yeah. Brian, is it music or is it something else that's more important to you?
It's not. No, it's not. Well, it's music, I suppose, was always important as well growing up. But I think for me, it's like we didn't have a huge number of books at home when we were growing up, but there was a certain number of books and texts that you would have been familiar with. Like as a Catholic family in Ireland, you're familiar with the Bible. Whether you like it or not, you're exposed to it every week, and maybe more. So some weeks, maybe a couple of times a week, with all the rituals, whatever that go around. Growing up in a Catholic country, so the Bible actually still stays with me, and I'm always amazed by the level of detailed knowledge I have of it still. And even like we would have had a book, an old collection of. Books on various topics as well, but they would have been we would have read them again and again, like in these pre-internet days. Now you can find out about anything. You had to kind of open an encyclopedia to read up on a subject if you were a kid and you were interested in something. So as kids, we kind of read the same few encyclopedias on various topics like history, and we knew everything that was in the history. Now it was probably very limited, but we knew a lot about that, and whatever was about the history of art, we might have read that as well. We knew a bit about that. We knew a bit about music, and then I suppose then you have kind of rock and roll music and that became a kind of sort of the rebellious side of your teenage years was you reacting again to your parents, and rock and roll and pop music or whatever were a reflection of that. But I still say even today, like there'd be more biblical references and art references than there would be music references, I think, in my poetry, which is strange. Now they may not be used in a biblical way or whatever, but there would still be those reflections of it still because of those texts. And similarly with old Irish myths and legends that we would have been told as kids or read as kids, they still recur because they fit into myths and legends from all around the world as well, because a lot of them are very similar and there's crossover between them. So if you're studying Greek and Roman or whatever it is, you're going to find similar events happening in Irish history and probably in old Icelandic sagas or whatever. So these kind of stories kind of would stay with me more than other things, you know, and you know, would probably be more formative, I think. And these could be things going back right to childhood rather than just teenage years, you know.
Yeah,
the great Bible, story about Yeats. Oh, sorry.
No, go ahead. Go ahead.
Oh, just a story about Yeats, who didn't want to go to church, so his parents said that he had to stay home and read. And I don't know if it was read poetry, but he chose to stay home and read. I remember thinking, yeah. So that's how you make a writer, maybe. Make something of a punishment.
Yeah. I think with the Bible, like it's, I don't think it was more mandatory maybe when you were younger, in school and things like that. Like you would have gone through it more and more, but it's really good to have those references. It is, I guess, the most read book in the world, or one of the top read books. So it's really rich references in it, and you know, it's yeah, I think it's a good thing to have. I wish I had more of it. I just know a few lines, but I don't know the thing in depth at all.
They say there are kids now who don't know who Adam and Eve are, though. So I don't know how widely the Bible's being read anymore. You know, but then they also don't know what acorn and kingfisher are. Those are the words that were taken out of the Oxford Dictionary. So upsetting, because really? Kingfishers, I have them all over my river here. Yeah.
Really, acorn? Like, it's not like the dodo. Yeah. It didn't go extinct.
I know. No, what's up? Robert McFarlane wrote a lovely book that uses all the words that were taken out. I don't know what the book's called, but maybe you do, Alba or Brian. But anyway, it's lovely, but I know they're lovely sort of concrete words. You'd think, I guess they were replaced with technical words. It's very sad.
Maybe there wasn't room for them in the publication. I don't know. It's funny.
That's the thing. They put new words in, words like non-binary and whatever, you know, modern words.
Cool. Let me see. Is there anything else? Was there anything you guys wanted to talk about, or was there anything you wanted to maybe bring up with one another, or?
Oh, where to begin? I look forward to reading the work on the page now, you know, and both of you. That'll be what I do next. And what's great about festivals is that you do get to, you know, you hear people you haven't read or heard before. The world has opened up, but there's more surprise. Great.
Yes. It's been fabulous to have all of you. We will need to wrap up now, but just before we go, there's a little donation jar above us. It's a link, of course, not a real jar, if you wanted to make a donation. So thanks to all of our viewers, to our 3 guest poets tonight, and of course to Paul for organising this whole festival and working tirelessly on this. All right.
Thank you.